In this tutorial, we'll do a deep dive into the Builderius Dynamic Data by showing how to display a list of current posts. If you want to see a simplified version, check the description and there should be a card popping up somewhere on the screen. But if you are interested in a deep dive, then let's jump right in. So here we are in the single post template for our book review CPT, and somewhere at the bottom we want to create a section where we display a list of related book reviews. To do that, we need to create a custom query, and the way we create custom queries is using the dynamic data, which is at the bottom of the screen. There's a section for dynamic data, which only works for pro version users. If I click on that dynamic data, I can go ahead and create my dynamic data. Since the data is going to be localized for that template, I'm going to use the template version of the dynamic data. I'll create a new variable and I'll call it something like related. And that will now create an object for us. So within this object is where we now put in all of our data. So the first example we're going to do is show how to display a list of posts that are from my book reviews CPT. Doesn't have to do with any relationship, just a list of all the posts from my book reviews CPT. So how do we do that? We have to now start with the function for post query. And that function, if you press Ctrl I, you get to see all of the different functions and fields we can use in any object. So in this object, there are different functions, but we're trying to get the query for posts. So we have post query, we have terms query, and users query. So we're going to use the post query, and the documentation for how post query works in WordPress. I'll leave a link to the documentation about the WP query, what are the parameters we can use, and what are the kind of values that those parameters require. So for example, if you want to see the author, it needs either an integer or a string. It says author ID or comma separated list of IDs. So it gives you an information of what you need. For integers, in Builderius, we just represent them as numbers. For strings, we represent them with a quotation mark and the item within that quotation mark. For arrays, we use the square brackets and so on. So there are notation we use for different kind of field types. So once you understand the post query, you'll be able to pull in the right data you need. So you can always refer back to this documentation from WordPress for all of the values that you need. So let's go ahead and start. Let's first go ahead and break down the function. So the way the function works in Builderius is start with a function name like post_query, which is the root query. Then we have regular brackets, and that's where you put in all of our parameters, like we saw in the WordPress parameters. And the parameter is our arguments. So within this argument is where we now put the key value pairs of, let's say, post type is equal to what? The post per page is equal to something. So that is the first portion. And then after we close the regular bracket, we now open curly brackets, and that's where we put in what are the values that we now want to return. For example, we want to return the post title, the post ID, and things like that. That's how most of the functions work. The regular bracket is when you want to define some parameters for the function. The curly bracket is when you're trying to determine what is going to be returned, the object that is going to be returned. And then when you see the square brackets, that is for arrays. So those are different notations. So for the first argument, I'll press Ctrl I and see what are the kind of arguments we can get. The arguments are things like the author, which is basically the same as what we see in the WP query. So there's no difference. So the first thing we may want to get is the post type. It has autocomplete, so you can just type a little bit of the words and it will tell you the completion word. And the post type is going to be my book-reviews, which we can actually get by going to the post type. So I can just go to my post types. So there's MetaBox post types. And the post type is book reviews. I can just copy the slug, because if you go back to the WP query and search for post_type, you see it says it requires you to put in the values as a string or as an array string. and it's a post type slug. So that's why we're copying the slug. Let me go ahead and paste that slug, which is what we have here. Then you can either put a comma or not. Builderius is forgiving, but let's just do it right and put a comma. And next thing is the posts per page. And I'll say maybe I only want 3, comma. Then we can say maybe things like order by or the publish status. So everything, you can just keep looking at all of the options there and choose the one that you think is right for your query. Let's say something like we want to get the status. So as the post status should be publish. I'll put the comma and maybe order by, maybe title. You can always refer back to the documentation and say maybe order by. And you can order by name, by author, by date, by title, and so on. So we're trying to order by title, which is the post title, comma, and then the order would be either ascending or descending. So I'll say ascending. Okay, so we have defined the arguments as the parameter for the post query function. Now, what are the values we want to return? Since we are creating a query of posts, we want to return our list of posts. So I'll press Ctrl I and see the type of values we can return. What we're interested in is a list of posts. So I'll click on posts, and within those posts, what are the different values themselves that we want to return? So like the ID of the post title, and so on. So I want to return the ID, the title, which is post title, maybe the permalink, then maybe the featured image. And within the featured image, I just want to return the maybe URL. Then the next thing I want to return is my meta box fields, which in this example, what I want to just focus on is the author of the book. I can go to my meta box. This is for meta box. These are the custom fields I've created. The main one I want is the book author. So I'll copy the slug or the ID. And I'll now say, since it's a meta box field, if you're using ACF, you search for ACF. But since I'm using meta box, let's search for meta box underscore value. Then the field ID is the name I copied, which is book underscore author. We can delete the option name because that's only for options pages. And I believe those are the important information we need. Let me go ahead and now say get data. And you see we can get the data that we need. And the nice thing about GraphQL is that you are getting only the data you need. You don't get any kind of random data. If you're using the REST API, that tends to just give you every data. But with the GraphQL, it gives you only the data you need. So that is one nice thing about GraphQL. And then within Builderius, we can do what we call adding of aliases so that we can make the names nicer. So instead of post underscore title, we can just call it title. To do that name change, we'll go before our return values. So this is the data structure we're returning. And we'll go before the field name and give it the name we need. So instead of post title, like I say, I want it to be title. So it will replace the post title as title within the object. Then the next one was permalink. I'll say URL colon. Then for my meta box value, I'll say book underscore author colon. Let's go ahead and get data. And see the name now has changed. So we have a nicer name now. And that's a better name that we can use. The next thing we can do is, instead of having to display there's a post query, then dot the posts before the values, we can basically come back to our post query, change the name of the post query, and do some transformation to the value so that the nested data can be returned as the direct children. Don't get lost. Just watch what I will do. I will explain a deep dive about expressions in a future video, but for now, I'm just going to be showing you how to use the expressions. So first I'll give it a name and say, in this case, we're trying to return the review underscore list column. The name has to have just letters, numbers, and underscores. You can't use the dash or any other special characters. So if we now do the get data, you see it's now review list, the posts, and all of the posts. But since we're only returning posts, I can simplify it and just say the review list will return my list of indexed array. So what we'll do is we'll go after the bracket to, after you've defined the function and its parameters, then I will now give it a directive. I'll put at and transform. Then I'll open brackets again because this is a function called transform. Within that function, I'm going to define some parameters, and the parameter that we need is the expression parameter. And the expression I'm going to use is, first I will refer back to this review list, which is the title. Then I'll say I want to access the posts within the review list, so dot posts. If I now press get data, it's going to transform the current value to return what I need. You can see now the review list is just returning my indexed array, and that's what we need. So I'm doing access the review list that was there before, get the posts, and return that post as the initial name. So that's what I'm doing. So just do some transformation. I can now go to the front end. I'll close the dynamic data, and within my collection element, the URL, which is a collection element, I'll delete the value we have there for now, choose the dynamic data tag, and search for my review list. And you see the name is quite nice. It's just called review list, which is what I need. And it's using the data variable which we created called related dot the name of the variable, which is review list. And we get back our tree data, and we can now start accessing the data. So I'll say the first one I want to access is the anchor, which is the post title. Let's return the title. Since we're already inside of the loop, for example, we're already inside of this loop, the collection element has gotten into the review list loop. So we don't have to define the loop name again. So we don't need to worry about this name of the data variable or the name of the actual alias. All we're just going to be concerned about is the name of the internal value. So in this case, we're looking at title, which is why we just search for title. Then for post author, which is under paragraph, I can remove the book author, and I can write it myself if I want. I called it book underscore author, and I get my value for book author. For things like the permalink, I can go to the anchor, delete the current anchor, and I can search for URL. That's what I called it. And finally, for the image, delete what we have there currently and search for featured image. And we get our featured image. So this is how we can quickly get our data, and everything is nicely formatted for us. And that's how we can get a list of posts from the post type called book reviews. And I've shown you along the way some nice ways you can format the data to become a more usable and nicer way. So we're done with the first portion. The second portion now is to go a step further and say we want the list of related posts to the current post. In order to do that, we need to first get some information about the current post, which are what is even the post ID of the current post, what are the list of terms from the current post, before we can now do that query of the posts that are related to the current post based on those taxonomy terms. So let's see how easy it is, and we'll also learn some new things along the way. So here we are back in our reviews list. The first thing I want to do is get the current post ID and the current list of terms. So to do that, I'm trying to get from the current post. I'll search for post. And what am I trying to get? The ID. So I'll search for ID, and I want to get the current list of terms. For that, we need what is called the WP term query, and it gives you the information we need. The two information we need from the term query are the taxonomy and the object IDs. The taxonomy is going to be a string, and the object IDs is going to be an integer. So those are the two things we need. So let's go back, and I'll search for term, and we see term query. So the arguments are, like I mentioned, taxonomy, which is genre, comma, and then the object IDs. It can be an array or an integer. In this case, we already have the value there called ID. So we're just going to reference that ID To reference another variable, we put quotation marks, and then we put 2 curly brackets, and then we write the name of the variable we're trying to access, which is called ID. And then what are we trying to return? Because we've given the parameter. Now, what are we trying to return? We're just trying to return the terms, because we're in a term query. When you query terms, what are you returning? Returning a list of terms. So I'm going to say T gives me terms. Within those terms, what are the actual fields that we want to return from those terms? I want to return maybe the term ID. So that's term ID, and maybe the name, just to make sure that everything's working. Let's go ahead and get data. And as you can see, we have the post, which is returning the ID of the current post, and a terms query returning the term ID and the term name. We can verify by going to the top of the page, and we can see the genre has contemporary. So that's the same thing, contemporary fiction, and the last one is also there. So everything is the same. So that means it's working. So now that we have our ID and our array of terms, how do we now use it in the post? We can go back to the post query, and you'll see that we can use what is called the taxonomy query. The taxonomy query is an associative array of WP tax query arguments. If you go into the tax query arguments, the 2 things we need is the relation and the array. So relation and array. In that array, we need to tell what is the taxonomy, what is the terms, and what is the field. The taxonomy is going to be a string and just says genre. The terms is what are the list of terms that we want to return. It can be a string, it can be an integer, or it can be an array. So in this case, we're going to be using an array. And then the field, is it going to be the term ID, slug, name? For the best results, I tend to use term ID. So that's why we're using term ID. So I'll come back. We'll go to our posts query, which is the review list. Within the arguments, at the bottom, I'll now add a new argument for taxonomy query. And we'll go into the array. And within that array, the items, like I mentioned, are taxonomy. The taxonomy is going to be genre, comma. The field is going to be my term ID. And then finally, the terms are going to be my list of terms. But like it mentioned, it has to be an array of terms. Right now, I'm having an array of objects. So we need to convert this array of objects into an array of just term IDs. How do we do that? We would have to perform some expressions. I will do a more deep dive into expressions in another video, which I will link to somewhere in the description. But now I'm just going to be using those expressions. To use expressions, we can either write it as a separate line using expression result, or we use a transform on the already existing variable. So I'm going to take the second option and use a transform on the already existing terms query variable. So we go back to the terms query. I'll give it a nicer name first, like maybe terms underscore list, colon. Then just after the list of parameters for the term, that's after the regular bracket, I'll then put at transform, open another set of regular brackets because the transform is a function, and we're going to put some parameters into that function. The parameter is just an expression. And I'm going to say I want to target the terms within the terms query. So I'll say terms underscore, I've changed the name, so it's going to be terms underscore list dot to access it. And I'm going to access the terms. Let's do get data. And it has transformed our initial terms query with a nested terms inside into a single array of indexed objects. So the next thing we need to do now is to return just the term IDs instead of having this array of key value pairs. So to do that one, I'll leave a link to the documentation in the description about array functions. The function we need specifically is the pluck function. Just before the start of my expression, I'll put pluck as the name of the function, open regular bracket, and close the regular bracket. So that's the name of the function. This is the variable, which is an array. And then I'm going to say comma. And then what am I trying to pluck from that object? I'm trying to pluck the term IDs. So I'm going to put in single quotes because it's a string, term underscore ID. The reason why we're using single quotes is because we're already in double quotes. We don't want to get any confusion of where does the double quote start and where does it end. So whenever you are inside double quotes, you now have to switch to single quotes. That's why I'm switching to single quotes. Then we can go ahead and get data. And you see now we're getting the proper array that WordPress needs, which is an array of the term IDs. And that's it. Then we can now continue with the next one, which is the review list. And the review list is the terms. So these terms now is going to reference the new value that we have called terms list. Since the variable is not a direct sibling, I could have just moved this terms list into the post. So the whole of the terms list, I can move it into my post so I can just directly access the variable as a direct sibling. But since it's an outer sibling and what we're looking for is the terms list within the post, what I'll now do is we now have to go to the terms, use the double curly bracket to start our variable accessing. And then I'll say first is the post dot the terms underscore list. And we'll now say get data. And you see we're getting the proper data. We're getting 3 related posts. Then the final thing we may want to do is within our post query, we want to ensure that we are not including the already existing current posts within that whole post query. So we can use another function that's called the post not in. So let's search for that. So it's called posts not in, which is an array of post IDs not to retrieve. So I'll come somewhere within the reviews list argument and say posts not in. And I'm going to be referring back to my post ID. So that's going to be quotation marks, double curly brackets, and then it's going to be post dot ID. Okay, get. And that's it. So finally, we can decide to just hide the entire post because we don't really need it anywhere else, only for our functions. So we can hide the entire post and just leave the reviews list. So I'll go to my post and then I'll make sure that it's after the regular brackets and before the curly brackets. Right now we have the curly brackets. So just after post, I'll put at private get data. And now the whole of this post is hidden. The only thing that is showing up is the review list. So I can now go ahead and save. Make sure I get data again to be sure I'm getting the right data. Close. And you can see if I go down to the bottom, I'm now getting my related posts to the current post, excluding the current post. So that's how we do it. I know I use a lot of functions. I'll try to write a more succinct blog post that explains all of the functions that I used. And I will leave a link to the WordPress WP post query, taxonomy query, the term query, as well as the Builderius functions. And I also have that simpler video which you can watch and see how you can just use snippets and within like 2 minutes, you're already gotten your value. Or you can use the other option, which is using the AI. And AI will just give you the answer in like 1 minute. So you can decide which one you want. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it wasn't too complex. And I'll see you in the next one.